Boccacio 70 is a 3 or 4-part, depending on which version you see, modern variation on the author's saucy sex stories in the Decameron. None of the segments is an adaptation of a Boccaccio story. Each stands alone and is individually close to feature length. The 4-part version, the only one to include the Renzo e Luciana segment, runs 208 minutes. Different stories, casts, and most notably directors are featured in each segment. The first segment, Renzo e Luciana, directed by Mario Monicelli, tells the story of a young working-class Italian couple frustrated by their inability to find some privacy so they can consummate their marriage. By far the weakest of the 4 segments, it doesn't lack ambition or scale. Quite the opposite. There are times when it seems the entire population of Rome is there to serve as 100% effective birth control. The result is an all too convincing evocation of an itch for a quick one that can't be scratched. To distract a little, there's a subplot involving Luciana's boss, with hints that he might provide even further impediment to their happiness, but that comes to naught. At best, it's a junior variation on the story's central vexation. Frustration is a dicey basis for storytelling because it practically negates narrative drive. Since we spend so much time stuck in neutral, Monicelli and company presumably staged this piffle on an epic scale to divert at least our eyes. Large crowd scenes, for example, may make an animated background, but they have nothing to do with the story, except that Renzo and Luciana happen to be there. The hordes of extras are not especially entertaining, and the contrived roadblocks to the couple's wedding night don't arise out of the situation. They are mechanically imposed to keep up the joke, such as it is. If we sympathize with the pair at all, it is for the negative reason that we are just as eager to get on to the next segment as they are to experience marital bliss. Still, some sympathy for Monicelli is probably in order as he competes with the 3 directorial heavyweights, Federico Fellini, Luchino Visconti, and Vittorio De Sica, in the other segments. His work is competent, even flavorful, but what he does hardly measures up to what any of the others could do in their sleep. And if competing with 3 of the masters of Italian cinema were not enough of a disadvantage, the other segments feature major stars, while Renzo and Luciana are played by unknowns. All Monicelli can do is point to the crowds that keep Renzo and Luciana out of bed and say, "Look what a big picture I've given you." Viewers can be forgiven for thinking that is not enough. The second segment, The Temptation of Dr. Antonio, is the first color film directed by Federico Fellini, a director I respect more than I like. That is not incidental, for Temptation is one of those films that stands or falls on your sympathy with the director's temperament. The story of puritanical zealot Dr. Antonio Mazzuolo's obsession with a billboard on which Anita Ekberg encourages people to drink milk, it teeters between a kind of sci-fi surrealism and the comedy of the grotesque, and offers little appeal beyond Fellini's outlandish mannerisms. To be sure, no Fellini film is ever less than distinctive. That is part of the problem. Besides the obvious and superficial thematic focus on repression, Temptation is not about anything other than the director's treatment of the material. When the story veers into science fiction territory as Ekberg's image comes to life and assumes gigantic proportions, we are clearly not in any world other than the filmmaker's fantasies projected onto a character. And those fantasies do not enrich or heighten experience. They are merely, obviously, and I dare say tritely, nothing but Fellini-esque. Antonio is as much prune as prude. We know when we first see him that he's desiccated by libidinal denial. It is only a matter of too much time before he succumbs to the results of his repression. The setup is too blatant and heavy-handed for the character to be anything but undone by his uncontrollable emotions. That's why the science fiction aspect is both necessary and vaguely offensive. Instead of understanding Antonio, or really eviscerating him for that matter, Fellini literally blows up the content to larger-than-life proportions, as if the outrage were enough to make up for the lack of perception. Of course, it's meant as satire, but comedy has an obligation to be funny. Having relied on fantasy as a substitute for the wit of Boccaccio's stories, however, Fellini doesn't do much with it. While Temptation does not exactly look like anyone else's work, it also doesn't provide the startlingly vivid imagery of the director's best films. His invention stops with the idea of making Ekberg into a giantess, which is another way of saying it doesn't go very far. That Ekberg romps through the Palazzo della Civiltà Italiana, a fascist-era relic, may be meant as some kind of political comment, but it's one best ignored. So, what does Temptation provide? Predictable material devoid of Boccaccio's sparkle, a basically unattractive protagonist, comic exaggeration instead of development, surprisingly little visual embellishment, and a tedious drawing out of the never terribly compelling situation. Fellini's name above the title and Ekberg's endowments do not compensate for the distasteful results. While more serious in tone than the other segments of Boccaccio 70, Il Lavoro, the job, the third of the four, is arguably the only one to come close to the feel of the Decameron. The combination of risque humor and a slightly acrid aftertaste is similar to the way Boccaccio leavens the sex in some of his stories with double-edged irony. In this story, Pupe, Romy Schneider, is married to Conte Ottavio, Tomas Emilian. Despite his title, she's the one with the money, which he squanders on sex with prostitutes. To demonstrate how little she cares, Pupe makes a bet with her father that she can get a job and fend for herself. The action, more or less in real time, is confined to only a few rooms of Ottavio's ornate palazzo. The essentially theatrical material allows director Luchino Visconti to work with an ease that the other three segments lack. Like Ingmar Bergman, Visconti had a distinguished parallel career in the theater. The casual fluidity of the filmmaking here attests to his comfort with the enclosed, limited situation, which is essentially a one-liner comedy of manners with a surprise ending that isn't much of a surprise. Ottavio is worthless, little better than an aristocratic bauble that Pupe's father has tied around her neck. Pupe, on the other hand, who practically purrs like one of her kittens, is aware of both men's weaknesses and plays them off each other like a virtuoso. Visconti stages their maneuvers with enviable assurance, blissfully unconcerned that movies are supposed to jump around as much as possible. Each shot is what we need to understand the action, no more, no less. He recognizes that the drama is internal in every sense, that gratuitous movement would only detract from the effect. He even gets away with introducing several characters, including Ottavio's lawyer, Romo only to have them sit quote-unquote off stage, as it were, in a library, while Pupe and Ottavio converse in her bedroom for most of the running time. In one of the wittier touches, the lawyer occasionally phones them in the bedroom to remind Ottavio and the viewer that they are still waiting in the library. Like Ottavio, Visconti was from an aristocratic background. That makes him intimately familiar with people with too much time and money on their hands. He also knows how to create, only to ignore the rich settings, perfect tailoring, and discreet servants. His camera moves through the gilded halls with the wide-eyed assurance of a native son. It is that insouciance that makes the bitter humor so effective. It's as if the director winks and says, "You see, under the chic, the rich are screwed up too." Given when it was made, 1962, it seems likely that the main reason for creating Boccaccio 70 was to exploit the star of its fourth segment, the raffle. While the directors had their share of fame, Sophia Loren was undoubtedly the biggest name of anyone associated with the project, at least in terms of popular appeal. While the writer, Cesare Zavattini, and director, Vittorio De Sica, were famous early lights in the Italian neo-realist movement, their critical cachet was less important in commercial terms than Loren's earthy charm. She doesn't disappoint. Like all great stars, Loren has the ability to bend any material to the shape of her persona. Her amiable sensuality suggests she feels her looks and vivacity are the most commonplace things imaginable. Whether the raffle provides something worthy of her matter-of-fact voluptuousness is another matter, however. Everything about the raffle feels a little synthetic. While De Sica and Zavattini were known for their interest in lower-class milieus, their most famous film together was Bicycle Thieves, the film's setting amidst carnival workers can hardly claim to offer a representative environment. Even less typical is the contrivance of having Zoe, Loren, who works one of the booths, auctioned off in a raffle by her brother-in-law. The supposed comedy results from the clumsy efforts of the horny men at the carnival to purchase the winning ticket. That all of the characters are created more for their theatrically colorful characteristics than for any serious examination of their social conditions makes the lumpen proletariat setting seem dubious. Zoe is not even asked her opinion of the raffle, as if she is expected to agree to the results no matter what they may be. Even when she falls for a young stud visiting the fairgrounds, there's no suggestion she won't go through with her brother-in-law's machinations. That De Sica stages this with consummate skill raises more questions. To be sure, the lively atmosphere is handled with playful good humor. Nonetheless, while not exactly slick, the raffle is made with the smooth surfaces only professional filmmaking can provide, and, given the material, the results come perilously close to sleaze. Instead of depicting the hardships the poor endure, the environment becomes an animated backdrop to pandering, of Zoe to the male characters and of Lorraine to us. Zoe is spared anything disagreeable when a harmless cipher wins the raffle, and the two of them let everyone think they did it. He's treated like a local hero, while she slips away with her hunk. The skill that goes into this ending may produce a certain charm, but it also makes the raffle, for all its proletarian pretenses, a monument to artifice.